"You're coming with me," the lonely rancher said to the woman beaten for giving birth to triplet girls. It was late January 1877, deep in the Wyoming Territory. The wind howled over the high ridges of the Snowhorn Mountains like a wounded beast, a sound Silas Granger knew better than his own name. But the first sound that caught his ear wasn't the wind. It was sharper, higher, the wail of something small and fragile. He pulled his horse to a stop, the snow crunching under its hooves, and he tilted his head. He listened. There it was again. A baby's cry. No, more than one. His eyes narrowed. He swung himself down from the saddle, his boots sinking deep into the powder. The path he was on hadn't been ridden in days, a pale scar cutting through the timberline. He led his horse by the reins, his breath coming in sharp, visible puffs in the biting air. The crying grew louder, more desperate, as he neared a clearing. And then he saw her. A woman, barely upright, tied to a rotted fence post with barbed wire. Her arms were bound tight behind her, the skin torn raw, her wrists bleeding onto the pristine snow. Ice clung to her eyelashes, freezing the edges of her hair in place. Her lips were cracked, her face as pale as death except for the violent violet bruises blooming across her cheekbones. At her feet, 3 small bundles. Infants. Newborns. One whimpered weakly. The other 2 were terrifyingly silent, wrapped in what looked like the shredded remains of a cotton nightgown. The woman's head moved, a slight pained motion. She was conscious. Barely. "Don't let them take my daughters," she whispered, her voice a ghost on the wind. Silas dropped to one knee without a second thought. He tore off his gloves, his bare hands instantly stinging in the cold, and checked each of the babies. Breathing. Shallow, but steady. Their skin was cold, the kind of deep cold that seeps into your bones and doesn't let go. "You're coming with me," he said again, his voice low, steady. A promise. She blinked slowly, as if the words were too heavy to lift. He took a knife from his boot, its edge keen and merciless, and sliced through the barbed wire. It had bitten deep into her forearms, and fresh blood welled where the rusted steel pulled free. But she didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She just sagged forward as her legs gave out, her body limp with exhaustion. Silas didn't hesitate. He scooped her into his arms, her head falling against his chest. Then he gathered the babies, one by one, tucking them inside his heavy coat, securing them with a thick wool blanket from his saddle. They were so small, so light. The wind picked up again, a razor blade against his skin. He shielded them with his body, his horse nickering anxiously beside him. He had a half-mile back to his cabin. Uphill. Through this snow. He adjusted his grip on the woman, tightened the blanket around the infants, and whispered to the wind, or maybe to God. "You don't die here. Not on my land." He mounted the horse with practiced care, settling her in front of him, the babies held securely between them. She weighed next to nothing. The cold had nearly taken them all. The trail back was a slow, brutal fight against the storm, but Silas moved without pause. There was no time to ask who she was or what kind of monster had left her to die. There was only time enough to keep her breathing. The cabin was dark when they finally reached it, the fire long dead. He kicked the door open, carried her straight inside, and laid her gently on a bed of quilts near the hearth. He placed the babies in a wooden crate lined with rabbit pelts, then turned to stoke the embers with hands that didn't shake. Not yet. Outside, the snow fell harder, erasing the tracks, burying the evidence of the horror that had happened at the fence post. Inside, Silas worked by the growing firelight, silent and certain. A stranger had been left to die. But as he looked down at her bruised face, he saw something under the grime and the blood. A small, crescent-shaped scar just below her ear. A scar he had seen once before, years ago, in a different life. And a cold dread, colder than the blizzard outside, settled in his gut. This wasn't some random stranger. And what happened out there wasn't random violence. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that trouble hadn't just found him. It had followed him home. The cabin was 4 simple walls against the Wyoming winter, its roof groaning under the weight of fresh snow. But it was dry, and the fire Silas had built now roared with life, pushing back the cold that clung to the corners of the room. He hung his soaked coat by the flames and peeled off his gloves, revealing the calloused, cracked hands of a man who worked alone. The woman, Meridal, lay unconscious on a pile of wool blankets. Her lips were still tinged with blue. He'd wrapped her torn wrists in strips of clean linen, but she hadn't stirred. The babies, however, had begun to make small, weak sounds. They were alive. Silas filled an iron pot with goat's milk and placed it on the hearth to warm. He walked over to the woman, his boots silent on the wooden floor. Her breathing was a shallow whisper. He dipped a cloth in a pail of warm water and began to gently clean the dried blood from her ankles and calves. The bruises were a deep, ugly purple. Someone had kicked her. Hard. And often. He worked with a strange gentleness, his large hands careful not to cause more pain. She didn't wake. When the milk was warm, he tested it on the back of his hand, then carried the small tin bowl to the makeshift cradle. The smallest baby had started to cry now, a thin, urgent whimper that tore at the silence. He crouched beside the crate and reached in. Her skin was warmer now. A good sign. He used a small carved wooden spoon to feed her tiny sips of milk. She took it clumsily at first, then with a desperate greed. He did the same with the other 2, pausing to wipe their chins and tuck the blankets tighter around their heads. A faint sound came from the bed. Her eyelids fluttered. "My name's Maribel," she rasped, her voice cracked. "Maribel Quinn." Silas stood and crossed the room in 2 long strides. He knelt beside her. "Silas," he said, his voice flat. The name Quinn landed in the quiet room like a stone. He kept his expression unreadable, but inside, a storm was brewing. Quinn. Of all the cursed names in this territory. Her gaze slipped past him, to the babies resting in the fire's glow. One of them let out a tiny sneeze. Maribel's eyes flooded with tears, a silent stream down her cracked cheeks. Her body was too broken to even sob. Silas rose and walked to the back of the room. From an old trunk, he pulled out a heavy fur cloak, thick elk hide lined with rabbit fur, and draped it over the basket, making the nest warmer, safer. When he looked back, Maribel was watching him, her eyes wide with a question she was too weak to ask. He simply gave her a slow nod and returned to the hearth. Sparks rose like fireflies, vanishing into the smoke-stained rafters. For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the shifting breaths of 4 people pulled back from the edge of death. Later, as Silas fed the fire one last time, he heard her voice again, a little firmer this time. "You didn't leave us." He didn't reply. He just sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He hadn't left her, no. But hearing that name, Quinn, he knew her nightmare was just beginning. And now, it was his too. Because Joseph Quinn wasn't just some cruel husband. He was the man Silas had run from years ago. The man who thought Silas was dead. And he would kill again to keep it that way. The storm outside softened to a hush, leaving a heavy stillness that wrapped the cabin like a shroud. Inside, the fire glowed, casting flickering gold across the rough timber walls. Maribel was propped against a stack of blankets, some color returning to her face. She could speak now, her voice raw but clear. Silas sat nearby, sharpening a blade against a whetstone with slow, rhythmic strokes. He hadn't asked a single question. That silence was a kindness she hadn't known in years. "I was 17 when I married Joseph Quinn," Maribel said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "He was 34, rich, powerful. My father said I was lucky." Silas didn't look up from his blade. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone continued, steady and relentless. "I thought I was lucky, too," she went on. "A big house with marble floors, silk dresses, but he was never kind." She glanced at her sleeping daughters, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect unison. "When the first girl was born, he frowned. The second, he stopped speaking to me. The third—" Her voice cracked. Silas finally stopped. He looked up, his eyes calm, waiting. "He called the midwife a witch, said she'd cursed my womb. He told his brothers I was no better than a mule, useless because I couldn't give him a son." She turned her face, showing him the faint old scar below her ear. The scar he'd recognized. "That night they beat me. I thought he'd kill me, but instead he dragged me to that fence post." Her hands trembled. "He said if the snow didn't take me, I was meant to live. He called it God's justice." She looked down at her hands. "He said girls were just more mouths to feed." Silas set the blade down. He didn't speak. He just stood, crossed the floor, and knelt beside her. He took her hand, swollen, bruised, scabbed, and held it gently in his own weathered palm. He met her gaze, his voice low and certain. "Here," he said, "your girls are the only thing worth feeding." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time she let them fall. She looked at this quiet, hard man, a total stranger who had shown her more decency in a day than her husband had in years. But there was something in his eyes, a shadow, a flicker of something that looked like recognition. "You know him," she whispered. It wasn't a question. The cabin grew deathly quiet. The fire popped, a loud crack in the tension. Silas's jaw flexed. He slowly let go of her hand and stood up, turning his back to her to face the fire. "I knew a man named Quinn once," he said, his voice tight. "A long time ago." Maribel stared at his broad back, a new fear coiling in her stomach. He wasn't just a random rancher who had stumbled upon them. He was connected to her past, to her monster. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked, her voice shaking. Silas turned, and the kindness in his face was gone, replaced by a grim hardness that matched the mountains outside. "I'm telling you that your husband doesn't leave loose ends. He didn't leave you out there to let God decide. He left you out there to die. And now that you're not dead." He let the sentence hang in the air, heavy and sharp as a guillotine. "He's going to come finish the job." The snow began to melt, turning white drifts to gray slush. Spring was coming, but with it came word from the lowlands. It arrived just after dawn, with a sharp knock on the door. It was a woman named Hattie, bundled in a green wool shawl, her horse panting by a pine tree. "Morning, Silas," she said, her voice clipped and urgent. "Hattie," he greeted, his face unreadable as he let her in. Maribel sat by the fire, holding one of the babies. Hattie gave her a quick, pitying glance before turning back to Silas. "It's about her," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Joseph Quinn's put out the word." Silas stood like a statue. "He's telling folks she ran off in a fit. That she's unstable. Says the babies are his property, and she's keeping them against the law." Maribel's fingers clenched around her daughter. "He's hired men," Hattie continued, her eyes darting around the small cabin. "4 of them. Says they're just looking to bring a mother home where she belongs. But the way they ride, Silas, it ain't no rescue party." Silas nodded once. That was all. Hattie looked between them. "I rode up as soon as I heard. They'll find this place." "They won't take her," Silas said, his voice flat. Hattie hesitated, then pulled a small leather pouch from her coat. "Dried lentils jerky, you'll need it." She pressed it into his hand, her eyes lingering on his for a moment too long. Then she was gone. The rest of the day was a blur of silent preparation. Silas repaired the latch on the rear window. He reinforced the door with a second crossbar. He moved supplies to the root cellar. He sharpened his hunting knife until its edge gleamed. As he worked, Maribel watched him, a knot of dread in her stomach. "She's lying," she said quietly. Silas paused, a hammer in his hand. "What?" "Hattie. She wasn't warning us. She was watching. She was looking at our supplies, the door, the window." Silas slowly lowered the hammer. He walked to the door and looked out at the tracks Hattie's horse had left in the mud. They didn't lead straight back down the mountain. They looped north, toward the Broken Bluffs, a place where hired guns and outlaws were known to camp. He turned back to Maribel, his face grim. "She wasn't a messenger," he said. "She was a scout. They're not just looking for you. They know you're here." The next morning, the air was too still. The birds had gone silent. Then came the sound. Hooves, 4 sets of them. Maribel clutched her daughters. Silas opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, unarmed. The riders reined in a few yards away. The man in front had a jagged scar down one cheek and a revolver strapped to his side. "Silas Granger," he called out. "We come with a claim from Joseph Quinn. That woman is his property. We're here to retrieve her." Silas stood still, his arms loose at his sides. "She's not his property," he said, his voice calm and clear. "And she sure as hell ain't yours," the man sneered. "You think you can stop us, Mountain Man? It's 4 against 1. "Is it?" Silas said, a strange, cold smile touching his lips. He lifted his gaze to the ridge behind them. The hired guns followed his look. They saw nothing but trees and rock. But Silas's confidence, his utter lack of fear, unnerved them. They were paid to collect a woman, not to die on some forgotten mountain for her. The leader hesitated. Was there someone else up there? A rifleman waiting in the trees? The mountain man was bluffing. He had to be. But what if he wasn't? He tugged on his reins. "Let's go," he barked at his men. "Not worth it today." They rode off, kicking up mud behind them. But they all looked back, their eyes promising a return. Silas stood on the porch until they were gone. He had won the first battle with a bluff. But he knew, and Maribel knew as she watched from the window, this wasn't over. They hadn't come to take her. They had come to see who was protecting her. And now that they knew it was just one man, they would be back. And next time, they wouldn't be so easily spooked. Spring finally took hold, coaxing green buds from bare branches. The days grew longer, and the cabin, once just a refuge, started to feel like something else. Something like a home. Maribel no longer flinched at every sound. She cooked small meals, stew made from wild onions and whatever Silas brought back from his traps. The babies, Eloise, Ruth, and June, grew stronger, their cries louder. They slept in a row of soft nests made from coyote pelts. Their life fell into a quiet rhythm. Silas would leave before dawn to hunt. Maribel would tend the fire and the girls. They rarely spoke of the past. It was a wound they had both agreed not to touch. But small comforts began to take root. One afternoon, Maribel found Silas at his workbench, carving a thin plank of cedar. He worked with quiet precision, the shavings falling at his feet. Later that night, she saw what he'd made. 3 small wooden plaques, hung above the baby's sleeping place. Eloise, Ruth, June. The names were carved in neat, careful script. The wood was oiled until it shone in the firelight. Maribel pressed her fingers to her mouth. No one had ever carved her daughter's names into anything permanent. Now they hung above their heads like a prayer, but the fragile piece was an illusion. A few nights later, while Silas was out checking the snares, Maribel was putting away his mended shirt. Her hand brushed against a loose floorboard beneath his cot. Curious, she pried it up. Inside was a small leather-bound box. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It held a faded photograph of 2 young men, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning. One was a younger Silas. The other was a man she knew instantly, a man whose smile she had learned to fear. Joseph Quinn. Beneath the photo was a yellowed piece of paper, a deed, for a large parcel of land down in the valley, the land that had belonged to her father. It was signed over to Joseph Quinn, with a second signature as a witness, Silas Granger. The air left her lungs. He hadn't just known Quinn. He had worked for him. He had been his friend. He had stood by and witnessed the very transaction that had led to her forced marriage, to her ruin. This man who had saved her was part of the reason she had needed saving in the first place. The cabin suddenly felt like a cage. The man she had started to trust was a liar, a ghost from her husband's world. She heard his footsteps on the porch. Maribel slammed the box shut, shoved it back under the floorboard, and stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. The firelight flickered across her face as the door opened. Silas stepped in, a brace of rabbits in his hand. He stopped when he saw her expression. The gratitude was gone from her eyes. In its place was a cold, hard accusation. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking with betrayal. "Who are you, really?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and heavy. Silas slowly set the rabbits on the table, his eyes never leaving her face. He saw the box wasn't quite flush with the floorboards. He knew she had found it. "My name is Silas Granger," he said quietly. "That's not what I asked," she shot back, her voice trembling with rage and betrayal. "You were his friend. You stood there and watched him take everything from my family. You helped him." "I was young," Silas said, his voice rough. "And stupid. I worked for him. I thought he was a good man, a builder. I didn't know what he was really doing until it was too late." "Too late?" she scoffed. "It was too late for me. I was the price for that land deed you signed." The pain in her voice was a physical blow. He flinched. "I didn't know about you, Maribel. I swear it. When I found out how he acquired that land, when I saw the kind of man he truly was, I left. I took my pay and I disappeared up here. I thought I was leaving that life behind." He looked around the small cabin, a place that had become his penance. "Quinn thinks I'm dead. A fever took me years ago, that's the story." "So you just ran?" she whispered. "You ran and hid while he destroyed people?" "Yes," he said, the word tasting like ash. "I ran. I was a coward." The confession, raw and honest, drained the anger from her, leaving only a hollow ache. He wasn't a monster in league with her husband. He was just a man who had made a terrible mistake and had been trying to outrun it ever since. And now his past had literally shown up on his doorstep, bleeding in the snow. A long silence settled over them, broken only by the gentle breathing of the sleeping babies. "So what now?" Maribel finally asked. "Now," Silas said, his gaze turning hard as flint. "We don't run. Your husband is coming back. Hattie told him I was alone. He's not going to send 4 men this time. He's going to come himself. He can't afford to have a witness to his past still breathing." The unspoken threat was clear. He wasn't just coming for Maribel and the girls. He was coming to silence Silas for good. Just as he said it, the wind outside began to howl. A low, mournful sound that grew louder and colder by the second. A storm was rolling in off the mountains, fast and brutal. Snow began to slash against the windows. "He'll use the storm for cover," Silas said, moving to bar the door. "He'll think it gives him the advantage." Maribel looked at the raging blizzard outside, then at the man standing before her. He was no longer a simple rancher, nor a traitor from her past. He was a man with a debt to pay. "He's wrong," she said, her voice finding a new strength. "The storm isn't his advantage. It's ours." Silas looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. The terrified woman he had carried from the fence post was gone. In her place was a survivor, her eyes burning with a cold fire that matched the storm. She knew this mountain now. She knew its secrets, and she was done being the hunted. The storm hit with a white roaring fury. Snow slashed sideways, erasing the world outside the windows. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed. "Take the girls to the root cellar," Silas ordered, pulling his heavy rifle down from the wall. "Stay there no matter what you hear." "No," Maribel said, her voice firm. She strapped the youngest, June, to her back in a sling she'd fashioned. "You can't fight him and his men alone." Before Silas could argue, a sound cut through the howl of the wind. A gunshot, close. They had shot his horse. A message. They weren't leaving without a fight. "He'll come to the front door," Silas said, his mind racing. "It's the only direct approach." "Then we won't be at the front door," Maribel replied. She grabbed an old elk fur cloak. "The north window. The latch is loose. He'll have men covering the back, but the snow is deepest on the north side. They won't expect us to go out into the teeth of the blizzard." He saw the logic in her eyes. It was a desperate, insane plan. It was their only chance. He nodded. "I'll draw their fire. Give you a head start. Follow the creek bed. It will give you cover. Head for Hattie's cabin." "Hattie's?" Maribel asked, confused. "She may have sold us out, but her place is the closest shelter. They won't think to look for you there. Go." He kissed each of his daughters on the forehead, his touch lingering for a heartbeat. Then he looked at Maribel. "Survive," he said. She slipped out the north window. The girls bundled against her and vanished into the swirling white chaos. Silas waited, counting to 100. Then he kicked over a table, sending it crashing to the floor. He fired his rifle out the front window, into the empty storm. The response was immediate. 2 shots splintered the doorframe. He had their attention. He moved through the cabin, a ghost in the firelight, making noise, drawing them in. He could hear them now, shouting to each other over the wind, closing the circle. The front door burst open, crashing against the wall. Joseph Quinn stood there, framed by the blizzard, his face a mask of cold fury. 2 armed men flanked him. "Granger!" Quinn snarled. "I heard you were dead. I should have made sure myself." "You were always lazy, Joseph," Silas said, his rifle steady. "Where is she? Where is my wife?" "She's not your wife, not anymore." Quinn laughed, a cold, empty sound. "She is my property. The children are my property. I'm leaving here with what's mine. And with your corpse." He raised his pistol, but just as he did, a new sound pierced the storm. A high, clear whistle. A signal. Quinn froze. He recognized that whistle. It was the signal his own men used in the field. From the back door, which had been silently unbarred, another figure stepped into the room. It was one of Quinn's own men, but his face was pale with fear, and his hands were empty. "What is this?" Quinn demanded. She wasn't alone," the man stammered. From the swirling snow outside the open back door, Maribel stepped back into the cabin. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding a lantern. And behind her stood 3 figures, emerging from the blizzard like ghosts. Local trappers. Men who owed Silas their lives from winters past. Men who had heard the signal whistle he and Maribel had arranged. Quinn's trap had become theirs. "It's over, Joseph," Maribel said, her voice ringing with authority. Quinn's face twisted in disbelief and rage. He swung his pistol toward Maribel. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Quinn's gun. Silas fired. The bullet hit Quinn in the shoulder, sending him staggering back into the snow. His men dropped their weapons as the trappers leveled their own rifles. It was over. Maribel rushed to Silas's side as he lowered his smoking rifle. He looked at her, then at the armed men who had come to their aid. He looked at his daughters, safe in the cellar below. He had thought he was a lone man on a mountain. But Maribel had shown him he wasn't. They had built something here, a community, a family. But as they stood there, amidst the wreckage and the swirling snow, Quinn, clutching his bleeding shoulder, started to laugh. A wild, unhinged cackle. "You think you've won?" He spat, blood on his lips. "You can have her. You can have the brats." He looked straight at Maribel, his eyes filled with a final, poisonous venom. "Because they're not mine," he sneered. "They can't be. I'm sterile. I've been sterile since I was a boy." "I don't know whose whelps those are, Maribel. But they are not the children of Joseph Quinn." The world stopped. The wind died down. The fire crackled. The only sound was the echo of his words. It had never been about a son. It was never about an heir. His rage, his cruelty, the beating, leaving her to die. It was all because she had exposed his secret shame. Her pregnancy was proof of her infidelity, proof that he was less than a man. The violence wasn't for tradition or disappointment. It was for a lie. The confession hung in the frozen air, more shocking than the gunshot. The trappers bound Joseph Quinn and his men, their faces grim. The truth of his cruelty was now laid bare. Not the act of a spurned patriarch, but the desperate, violent cover-up of a fraud. He hadn't wanted an heir. He had wanted her father's land, and the triplets were a living, breathing testament to a betrayal that threatened his entire empire. Maribel stood frozen, the revelation washing over her in waves of shock, then horror, then a strange, unexpected liberation. The girls were not his. The blood of that monster did not run in their veins. They were hers, and hers alone. She looked at Silas, whose face was a mixture of shock and dawning understanding. He finally understood the depth of Quinn's depravity. As the town sheriff, summoned by one of the trappers, led Quinn away, the man looked back at Maribel one last time. There was no remorse in his eyes, only pure, uncut hatred. But it held no power over her anymore. He was just a pathetic, broken man, his empire of lies crumbling around him. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. The dawn broke clear and cold, the new snow glittering under a pale sun. In the quiet aftermath, Silas and Maribel began to rebuild. Not just the cabin door, but their lives. The final secret was out, and with it, the last of Quinn's shadow was banished from their mountain. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and healing. Silas's past was no longer a ghost to be outrun, but a scar that had led him home. Maribel, no longer a victim of a cruel man's shame, was the fierce matriarch of her small, unconventional family. Word of what happened on Granger Ridge spread. People started calling Joseph Quinn, Quinn the Baron, and his reputation shattered. His lands were seized, his power broken. Justice, it turned out, sometimes found its way even to the highest mountain peaks. The cabin on the ridge slowly transformed. What was once a hideout became a haven. They extended the east wall, built a larger hearth. Travelers on the trade trail learned that a hot meal and a safe night's rest could be found there. They called it the Hearth at Granger Ridge. Maribel cooked, and Silas hunted. The three girls grew, their laughter echoing through the pines. Eloise walked first. Ruth's first word was, "Fire." June sang before she spoke a single word. One evening, after the last traveler had left, Silas found Maribel on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the peaks. He didn't say anything, just handed her a shawl he had woven himself. It was a deep burgundy, and in one corner, he had stitched 3 initials, E.R.J. And beneath them, a single word, worthy. She ran her fingers over the thread, her breath catching in her throat. "You chose us," she said softly, "when you could have just walked away." He stepped forward and took her hand. It wasn't a proposal, it was a promise. That night, by the crackling fire, with their daughters sleeping peacefully nearby, they made their vows. Not with rings or a priest, but with quiet words and steady hearts. He gave her a string of carved wooden beads. She gave him her hand, and in doing so, gave him everything that mattered. Spring returned to the mountain, blanketing the ridge in wild violets. The scent of pine and baking bread filled the air. Children's laughter was the new sound of the snow horns. Eloise, Ruth, and June danced in the yard, grass-stained and joyful. Maribel watched them from the kitchen window, a soft smile on her lips. The hearth at Granger Ridge had become a quiet legend, a place built not from timber and stone, but from courage. That evening, Silas sat on the porch steps, a basket of green beans beside him. Maribel came out and sat beside him, handing him a mug of pine tea. The girls chased fireflies in the twilight. She rested her hand on his. "This fire," she said, her voice soft. "It never went out." Silas looked out at the darkening mountains, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It just needed a place to live," he replied. They sat there for a long time, hand in hand, as the sky turned to lavender and the first stars appeared. No one passing by would ever know the whole story, the blood in the snow, the storm, the fight. But they would see the way she smiled at him, the way he watched her, and the way 3 little girls danced in a patch of mountain sunlight, and they would know, without a doubt, that something powerful and true had been built here, something that could survive even the worst of winters. Thank you for riding with us through this tale of fire, frost, and a love that refused to fade. In a land where justice was rare and warmth even rarer, Silas and Maribel proved that sometimes the strongest homes are built not from timber or stone, but from trust, from sacrifice, and from choosing each other when it would have been easier to walk away. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even in the harshest places, love can take root and grow, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable journeys into the heart of the American frontier. Tap that bell so you never miss a story that just might stay with you forever.